Hello and welcome once again to the Yards After Catch, the Yak podcast. Of course, talking about wide receivers, and I'm Big Italy 42. He is Scott Mayo. We got Sports 25 to life, and if this first name surprises you, then you're certainly doing it wrong. Antonio Brown for the Steelers, coming off a monster game last week, and as it has been for the first couple weeks this year, it's been Julio Jones or Antonio Brown. Decide who you pick. If you went with Brown last week, certainly neither one was a disappointment, but Brown, nearly 200 yards and a touchdown, got a 2-point conversion as well. Had a huge game. He was popular, and despite the fact that Le'Veon Bell is coming back, I don't see that changing much as far as production for Antonio Brown. We've seen both guys be plenty productive together before, so Antonio Brown, easily for me, and as I can see for you as well here in this article, has got to be your top option once again.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to argue anyone else against him.
Yep.
Over the last 16 weeks, he's averaging something ridiculous like 9.4 catches, 117 yards, and 1.3 touchdowns.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a game you'd be ecstatic to get from anyone else for any price, any week, basically, and that's what he's giving you on average. I mean, last week he went crazy for 9 catches for 186 yards and a touchdown. Le'Veon Bell coming back should draw more attention away from him than anything. I mean, it wasn't like he was getting massive target numbers with Bell out. He had 9 of 11. He caught 9 of 11 targets last week. He's a ridiculously efficient guy. That's another guy that's been with Ben Roethlisberger for what feels like forever now. It's hard to argue with him as a cash game or GPP play, honestly, because he has the highest floor of anyone at wide receiver and as high of upside of anyone at wide receiver. I mean, we've seen him have multiple 200-yard, 2-touchdown games over the last 2 years. I mean, it's really hard not to play him at this point, basically in any matchup. I mean, St. Louis's defense is fine. They have some pretty good corners, but I just don't see any reason that you can't play him. I mean, we saw the 49ers totally shut down the Vikings passing game week 1, and then Roethlisberger, Brown, and Miller just lit them up week 2.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is one of, if not the best offense in the NFL right now, I think, especially balance-wise now with Bell coming back. We saw D'Angelo Williams run ridiculously well behind that line. I can't imagine how good Bell's going to look this week with D'Angelo Williams in the change of pace role. This team's going to score a ton of points all year. It's a 47 over-under in this game. I mean, there's absolutely nothing that I can argue against Antonio Brown for, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me, he's the best. He's certainly, like you said, the most consistent, but I think he's the best wide receiver in football. I mean, he's literally uncoverable. He's on that. I'm not sure what the number is now in his consecutive games with at least 5 catches for 50 yards, but I think he broke that record over a year ago, and he just continues to add to his streak. So it's just his consistency is just remarkable. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, like I said, I'm going to play him as much as I possibly can where I can afford him. Only reason I would fade him is because I was looking to be contrarian. I mean, other than that, there's really no other reason not to play him.
Yeah, completely agree with you there. And then next up, DeAndre Hopkins for the Texans. We saw week 1, he had a huge performance. He was on a lot of the big GPP winning teams. And Panthers kind of took him out of the game week 2. Arian Foster, we were hoping he was coming back this week. Obviously, he wants to play. He wanted to play last week. Bill O'Brien said he doesn't expect him to play. You kind of take stock in that, so that's going to tell you once again he's going to be the number 1 option. And with them integrating Chris Polk instead of Alfred Blue for the most part in the running games, giving them more consistency because Alfred Blue is just not a very good runner at all. And DeAndre Hopkins, huge deep ball threat, great possession receiver, good red zone target. This is one of the better receivers that nobody ever talks about, and this is a bad Tampa Bay defense. I'm not buying anything into what they did last week. That was more of a product of the Saints being terrible than it was the Buccaneers being good. So Hopkins, one of these guys that, especially this, it's not a bad price tag either. I think he's going to be
it's a great price tag. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the only concern right now is I saw the news about his concussion just came out, and he's dealing with that. But I saw someone on Twitter, I think it was actually Denny, that tweeted that Hopkins is for sure going to be cleared because stars always get cleared from the concussion protocol, which is pretty true, honestly.
Yeah.
I'd be pretty surprised if he didn't play, but he is questionable right now, so definitely keep an eye on that. Nate Washington and Cecil Shorts would both be target monsters in this game if he doesn't play. But I think Hopkins is probably going to rack up 15 targets in this game pretty easily if he plays. And that's going to be 7-8 catches for a guy that averages almost 14 yards a catch in his career. So we're looking at a massive game for a price tag that's quite a bit cheaper than the other elite guys, and I think he's almost as elite as them this week, assuming he's healthy and playing a full complement of snaps. He's really similar to Gronk for me, where I don't think he's quite as talented as Gronk, but but he's priced like a guy that's not as talented as he is and in as good a situation as he is. So if he's in, I'm going to be mixing him into my lineups a ton. I really think he's probably my second favorite, maybe third favorite receiver this week. Obviously, Beckham's playing on Thursday night, so he's kind of out of the equation. And at his price, I prefer him to Julio Jones this week. So Julio Jones has a much tougher matchup and is much more expensive. I think Hopkins has as much upside as him, and honestly a pretty solid floor for a guy that's going to get a massive amount of targets.
Yeah, I'm on board with that as well. And like you said, I mean, he's going to see lower ownership. People are just going to instantly lock in guys like Julio Jones in this one. So it's going to be nice for his ownership levels. Next up, another Cowboys player. We got Terrence Williams here. Obviously, Brandon Weeden under center now. We got Des Bryant out, so plenty to go around, assuming that Brandon Weeden's capable of getting the ball around.
Yep.
And Terrence Williams looked like a bust last week. Got that late touchdown pass from Brandon Weeden. I mean, I remember watching that game. It seemed like the Eagles' defense were all just in place, standing, and not moving. He caught that slant route and just kind of walked into the end zone. But, I mean, this is essentially an even better matchup against an Atlanta team that's just awful. I mean, obviously, they're not just going to be standing still like statues, but they may as well be, because this is a terrible secondary. And Terrence Williams, we know, a deep threat. And really, the only thing keeping him from being a great deep option in this game is possibly Brandon Weeden. But at the same time, he's going to be throwing the ball a ton because they're going to be daring him to throw. If I'm any defense against Brandon Weeden, I'm going to be loading up the box and daring you to throw the ball down the field. So, got to imagine he's going to see plenty of targets here.
Yeah, like we talked about with Witten on the tight end podcast. I mean, Brandon Weeden's going to be a guy who's throwing to his first and second reads, which is going to be Terrence Williams and Jason Witten basically every play. So I'm expecting a ton of targets for both of those guys. Probably not as efficient as they were with Tony Romo, but I think the volume's going to make up for it. And like you said, this is about as good a matchup as you can get if you're not playing the Bears. Yeah. It's a team that's given up a ton of passing yards over both of the first two games. Williams is a solid player. His price has barely gone up at all from last week when he was ridiculously underpriced, and he's an even better play with Witten banged up this week and probably a nice boost in targets. So he's a guy that I'm going to be playing a ton of.
Yeah, low-risk type of play at his price tag, certainly. Next up, Doug Baldwin for the Seattle Seahawks. As you mentioned, if you have a better matchup, it's going to be the Bears, and this is a matchup against the Bears for the Seahawks. You mentioned 7 catches in each of the last 2 weeks. It's been one of these situations with the Seahawks of the last couple of years where they're an effective offense, but the ball's spread around a lot, so you don't usually target a lot of the wide receivers. But Baldwin certainly emerged as Russell Wilson's favorite here in this passing game, as far as wide receivers go, at least. And he's really, really cheap, just $4,000 on DraftKings. They're going to be looking to him, and I mean, there's not going to see a whole lot of resistance from this Bears defense. That's just, I mean, this defense is just a joke, and I'm being kind in saying that.
Yeah, I mean, Baldwin's got back-to-back 7-catch games. He's the one guy that Russell Wilson looks to when he needs a big play. Not necessarily a long play, but like third and short, that type of stuff. I mean, I think Jimmy Graham is going to take over more of that role as the season goes on, but right now that's Baldwin's role. And, I mean, he's been the leading guy in targets to the first 2 weeks. Like you mentioned, the Bears' defense is terrible. He's still really cheap, great PPR play, as he always has been. And he's shown a little bit more upside this year with some of the other Seahawks wide receivers not playing really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And then next up, John Brown for the Cardinals. Obviously, Larry Fitzgerald's going to be a popular play this week, coming off a huge game last week. He's going to be taking a ton of ownership from everyone, but John Brown in particular. Has been a very effective passing game with Carson Palmer in Arizona. Run game, not so much. We saw Chris Johnson was the workhorse, if you want to call him that, last week. 20 carries for 72 yards, but I mean, he's just simply just not a good runner at this point in his career. I mean, he was never a great runner, and he was just more of a speed back. But John Brown's going to be a guy that really flies more under the radar than he rightfully should in a matchup against the San Francisco team that, granted, this isn't quite the Steelers' offense, but this secondary looked absolutely horrible last week.
Yeah, and the Cardinals have looked really good. I mean, Brown's been pretty average in terms of actual production, but he's leading the NFL in pass interference yards drawn, so he's definitely getting open.
Yeah.
There's a big game coming here at some point. He's been pretty similar to Fitzgerald in targets. Fitzgerald's just been ridiculously efficient with them and hasn't been drawing as many pass interferences as Brown. I mean, Brown had what was going to be a 55-yard touchdown last week that he was wide open for, that someone just tackled him before he could catch the ball last week. So I know there's a big game coming here. I keep putting him in this spot in this post because I really am confident in it. And he hasn't been bad over the first 2 weeks. He's got 9 catches for 100 yards and 1 touchdown. So, I mean, there's a lot to like here. It's not a massive over-under at 44, but they are favored. So I think they're about 26 team total. I know the big game's coming. I'm going to keep playing him. He's priced pretty fairly everywhere. I don't like him in cash games a ton just because he has that 4-catch, 40-yard kind of downside, which isn't terrible, but it's not great at his price either. But I'm going to mix him in a ton in GPPs.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about the pass interference calls because everyone just looks at targets and they look at production, and that's a big one. I mean, that's a lot of the reason why we also saw Carson Palmer. His numbers looked even more efficient than they actually even were last week because of all these pass interference calls down the field, mostly by John Brown. So
yeah,
that's a really good point there. Next up, everyone's favorite player they love to hate until the final, 10 seconds of the game last week. Jordan Matthews, a guy that I personally had in my cash games that kind of bailed me out at the last second, bailed out a lot of people, and those of us who probably didn't deserve to get bailed out there, but finally produced. And I mean, this is a guy that's an elite talent. He's in an offense that's really struggling. Now we're seeing DeMarco Murray, hamstring injury. Perhaps he sits out. The reports I'm seeing, nothing definitive, but looks like he's on the wrong side of questionable now. So that's just going to mean they're going to be looking to the pass game even more. He's obviously the focal point of this passing offense here. And another one of these recency bias things where people said, well, he screwed me for 3.5 quarters even yesterday. Pretty much caught every pass on that final drive, I think, 5 of them or something like that. So, but this is a guy that, he's got big upside. He's got a nice floor, and it's somewhat contingent on Sam Bradford, but especially if DeMarco Murray sits out. Not that he's done a whole lot, but, this is going to be a pass-first attack.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the question is how much Revis does he see for me? But he plays in the slot almost exclusively, which is usually a place where they don't try to stick Revis on someone 100%. So that's why I have him as a GPP play. If I thought he was getting Revis 100%, I'd probably just leave him alone. But he's underpriced, has a lot of upside if the Eagles can get the offense clicking at all. Even if he only sees 40% of Revis, I feel pretty good about this game. I mean, Sam Bradford just heavily targets the slot receiver. So, I mean, we saw what he could do on one drive last week at the end of that drive. So, I think there's a lot of upside here, even if there's also a lot of downside.
Yeah, and another thing to note here is that Darrelle Revis didn't practice yesterday with a groin injury.
That's a good point.
And we're not hearing any sort of information about it, which makes you tend to believe that it's worse than they're letting on. So maybe he doesn't even play. And like you mentioned, the less Revis, the better. And if he doesn't play at all, then, I mean, that's a huge downgrade for the coverage there. So that's a big boost for him.
Definitely.
Next up, Donte Moncrief for the Colts. Was a popular play last week. Especially it was a Monday night game, so if you took the risk on him in FanDuel, I saw a ton of them in cash games, which I didn't quite have the I don't know, I don't want to say the balls to do, but he wasn't a guy that I was really looking at for cash games because of T.Y. Hilton's status, but he outproduced him in a big-time way. He was a major target for Andrew Luck, and what was a pretty terrible performance overall by the Colts, but he was the lone bright spot. He's still cheap across the industry. And, I mean, he's a deep threat. He's a guy that's, I mean, he's looked great recently. And he's been the one guy that's been consistent for Andrew Luck. And you got to imagine, against his Tennessee defense, that's simply not very good defense. I mean, average at best. Andrew Luck and the Colts have to win this game. I mean, they're 0-2. So you got to imagine they're going to get back to the basics. And you got to think that Donte Moncrief's in line for another big game.
Yeah, I mean, he's led him in targets each of the first 2 weeks. Probably a touchdown in each game is unsustainable. But if he's going to lead the Colts in targets in a passing game that should be really good at some point. I mean, he's been really effective when they haven't been good. So assuming they can get it turned around, I mean, even if he regresses a little bit, he's going to be a really solid play. Still too cheap. Like you mentioned, Tennessee, they're 29th in effectiveness against the passing game over the last 16 games. So that's a really good matchup. I'm going to mix him in a decent amount. I don't feel great about him in cash games just because, I mean, I feel like we could see him disappear like Hilton and Andre Johnson and Gore have at different times. But if the Colts get going, which they should against the Titans, it's hard to see him having a really poor game.
Yeah, I'm certainly with you there. GPP guy for me. Keenan Allen was one of the highest scorers, better performers week 1. Had 16 catches on 17 targets, set the team record for catches in a game. Had a huge game there. But then week 2, Bengals kind of keyed on him, took him out of the game for the most part. So he's another one of those guys. Take advantage of the recency bias. No one's going to be looking at, not no one, but he had much low ownership after a subpar outing, which really wasn't his fault. He saw a lot of tough coverage last week. now facing the St. Louis defense, which, as we mentioned, a tough front seven. Secondary still not a great defense. I mean, above average, but certainly he's the go-to guy in this Chargers offense here in the passing game. So you got to imagine, especially at a solid price for a guy that has big time upside, even if he doesn't find the end zone, this guy could have a huge game.
Yeah, I mean, he's the definition of a GPP play after you've seen what he's done the first 2 weeks. He won you basically everything if you played him week 1. He lost you basically everything if you played him week 2. So, I mean, with Phillip Rivers, there's always monster target upside. You would think that after they struggled quite a bit last week that they'd go back to him a bunch this week. So I like him quite a bit in GPPs. I don't trust him in cash games like at all. I don't want to mess around with a guy that only got 4 targets in week 2, but that's what everyone's going to be thinking in GPPs too. So that's going to leave his ownership percentage way too low.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to wrap things up. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. We've got lots of great content for this sport and every other sport at dailyfantasycafe.com.